Did you know that it's illegal to have a gun registry or a registry of gun owners in the United States? We've talked a little bit about this on the channel, but now we're going to dig down deep into a historian with Stephen Halbrook, Second Amendment historian, who's going to talk about the history of gun registration across the globe and about his book, Gun Control in the Third Reich, and the lessons that the U.S. Congress learned from what Germany did in the 30s and what the U.S. Congress learned in the 1940s up until now. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss this. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and best-selling author. If you have not already subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so. We really would appreciate it as we try to grow this channel rapidly. We're even on Twitter to help us do so. So Stephen Halbrook, let's talk about a topic that's sort of, you're a real expert in. I mean, you wrote the definitive book on gun control in the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. And before we touch fingers with gun registration in the United States, why don't you just briefly tell us about what you learned from your powerful book that involved translating thousands and thousands of German documents into English to be able to really, drill down into this. What did you learn about gun registrations and the dangers of them from Nazi Germany and what we as Americans can learn here today?
Well, what piqued my interest was in 1968, there were proposals in Congress to add to the Gun Control Act gun registration. And a debate developed about gun registration. Congressman John Dingell, Democrat from Michigan, argued that this is something that we know of from Nazi Germany. And the proponents of regulation said, oh no, that never happened. And so I was just an undergraduate at the time, but over the years I got interested in the subject and I ended up writing the book, Gun Control of the Third Reich, Disarming the Jews and Enemies of the State. And what I found was in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, a registration system was passed. The Waffen Gazettes of 1928, gun law of 1928, first gave authorities a lot of power over who could have guns and keeping track of like carry licenses, things like that. And in 1931, actually this was an executive decree, not even passed by the Reichstag or the Parliament, saying that implementing gun registration, but with a warning from one of the top officials that we can't let these registration records fall into the hands of radical elements. And they had in mind like Nazis or communists breaking into police stations and getting the registration rolls. But it turned out a lot worse than that, because radical elements took power in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, and they used the very same registration records to go after all their political enemies. They disarmed all the social democrats and all the people who got these laws passed originally. And then in 1938, they used those registration laws to look up all the Jewish gun owners in connection with the Night of the Broken Glass. And so that's what the book is about. But we Americans were aware of all of this. That's why in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, Congress passed the Property Requisition Act, which allowed the federal government to requisition all kinds of property for war use, but it specifically said you cannot use this to require registration of firearms or in any way to violate the individual right to keep and bear arms. The Congress was well aware that registration lists were being used to disarm people and then to oppress them and commit genocide. So when the 1968 law was passed and the Carter administration came along, ATF tried to require dealers to send all the records of gun purchasers, and Congress exploded against that, and I think it was in 1978 that they passed a appropriations rider that's gone into the law every year ever since against registration of guns by ATF. Finally, in 1986, the Firearms Owners Protection Act has an explicit anti-registration provision that ATF has no authority to register guns, gun owners, or gun transactions. The Brady Act from 1993 has a similar provision. When they do that NICS check, they're not allowed to keep the records, and the Department of Justice has is prohibited from registering firearm owners or firearms. And so that's our background to that topic. Americans don't go for gun registration.
So right now, Stephen, the law of the land right now at the federal level is you cannot create a gun registry of gun owners or guns. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the question becomes, why is the Biden administration, the ATF, seems to be so desperate to try to label every single possible thing a firearm, because you can then, once it's a firearm, presumably you can then force it to be serialized and registered somewhere. Is that what's going on here? Is the Biden administration trying to get every single so-called ghost gun, do-it-yourself gun, anything they get their hands on, serialized and registered somewhere because they're trying to backdoor in a gun registry of guns and gun owners? Is that what's really going on here today?
Well, a little more statutory background. Gun dealers have to keep records, like 4473 that you fill out where you say you're not a felon, all that stuff. And they keep that, and they keep an acquisition and disposition book. And so ATF has access to that for a bona fide criminal investigation, but they can't take those records, just the general records, out of the gun shop. But when the gun shop goes out of business, the dealer goes out of business, he's required to send the records to the ATF Out of Records Business Center. But Congress has provided that ATF can computerize the dealer information and the serial numbers so they can do a trace, but they cannot computerize the actual information about the people who bought the guns, like the 4473 form that you fill out, for example. ATF is in the process of digitizing those records, but they're not supposed to have computer access to those records. In other words, you've got millions and millions of records, probably tons of records of out-of-business records that they're scanning, basically. But they can't be computerized, so that you can only computerize the records that tell you who the dealer is and the firearm serial number and identification.
So in other words, what you're saying is they cannot computerize. If I go down and I buy a handgun today and I fill out the 4473, they can computerize the fact that the FFL that I bought the gun from did the transaction and the serial number of the firearm, but they cannot digitalize or computerize or put in a database who they sold the gun to or transferred the gun to. Is that right?
Right, and they cannot even do that with the dealer until the dealer goes out of business. Now, here's what the Biden administration did change. It used to be the regulation was that a dealer would have to keep records for 20 years, after which they could be destroyed. They would not go to the out-of-business center for ATF. The new regulation says they have to keep them forever. And then when they go out of business, you might have records being turned over to ATF that are 30 years old. And so that's the difference. And that's why people are afraid that the records could be used someday to put in computerized form. The funny thing is they're so old. You know, a lot of the people are going to be dead by then. And by the way, tracing has never been an effective law enforcement tool to catch criminals. I mean, normally, if you find a gun at the scene, maybe there's been a murder, and being able to trace the gun doesn't help you. You caught the murderer already. So that's always the reason given for all of these records is the ability to trace, but it's really not what it's touted to be.
Yeah, I know it's really odd because, again, I think a lot of these gun control laws have nothing to do with protecting Americans from actual violent criminals. This is about harassing our gun owners and the gun companies and negatively impacting our Second Amendment rights. Because the reality is, if you talk to any police officer, first of all, most of the crimes, the violent crimes, are often committed by people if you see unfortunately a dead spouse, the first question is, well, who were they married to? Who are they in a fight with in the family? Did they have a boyfriend or girlfriend? So usually a lot of these violent crimes often get solved pretty quick. And number two is, often if there is a violent crime, guns are valuable, and criminals don't generally like to leave valuable things behind at a crime scene. So odds of being able to find a gun left behind at a crime scene is not particularly high, because usually the criminals are going to take the guns with them. So you're really looking at a small percentage of cases. And then what is the purpose of the tracing? So you trace the gun back to a gun dealer in Washington State, and now where does that get you? So, okay, well, what? I sold the gun to Bob 15 years ago, and now what? It just seems to me that tracing is a lot of wasted time, and I'd be surprised that they solve any real crimes at all. Are there any data or thoughts on that, Stephen? Is this actually an effective law enforcement tool?
Well, I mean, traces. Some agencies in some states trace guns that are encountered, regardless of whether the gun itself was supposedly used in a crime. In New Jersey, if they seize any gun, they might go into your house and serve a warrant for tax fraud. If they find any guns, they're going to trace them. That does nobody any good. But on another subject about ATF, it's one thing. There have been times when ATF, its mission had been, let's go after the gangbusters. Let's go after the violent criminals who are using guns for drug trafficking, things like that. And in the 2020 riots, let's help find out who committed arson that burned down these buildings. ATF was involved in that. There's nothing wrong with that. But then when you get the priority of ATF becomes, let's hang out in gun shows and see if we can try to bust somebody for selling one gun too many, or let's go, like recently, let's go knock on doors and people who passed the background checks and legitimately bought guns, and tell them, we want to see your guns and we want to check your serial numbers.
Stephen, what is your impression of this recent ATF tactic of, I guess it's called knock and talk, where they're just literally showing up at gun owners' homes, knocking on the door with a gun on their hip, asking, we just want to talk to you? Because it seems to me that's not an arrest, because it's not an arrest, the law enforcement agents at your door have no duty to give you your Miranda rights and say, hey, you don't have to talk to us if you don't want to. What's going on with that? And what would your advice be if all of a sudden one of our gun-owning viewers, some law enforcement just knocks on the door and is like, hey, we want to chat?
There's no law prohibiting them from doing that, but it's a terrible invasion of privacy. It's very intimidating. If somebody just bought a gun and they passed the dang background check, why are they going to that person's house? What the person should do is to say, if you've got a warrant, please show me the warrant and I'll assist you. But if you don't have a warrant, goodbye. Nice to see you again. It's really a bad policy. It's so intimidating, and the very idea that all you did was exercise your Second Amendment rights by buying a gun, and then you've got federal agents with guns on their hips showing up at your door. That's not the look. They need to be down there busting the gangs, and let's go to the violent parts of town and get the people who are committing acts of violence and dealing all the drugs and shooting innocent people. Go to Chicago, get a life. Do some law enforcement.
Yeah, well, I think we know that that's too much work, and that's not where a lot of these federal agents, as best I can tell, want to focus their efforts. They're more worried about law-abiding gun owners and doing things to harass them through these malum prohibitum victimless crimes, as we've talked about before, and not actually going after the actual violent thugs that aren't allowed to be touching guns in the first place. Beyond that, Stephen, it's just very fascinating that I find it also quite dangerous because, I've always said that criminals who are in the business of violent crime, they expect to encounter law enforcement. It's just part of their job. It's part of their lifestyle. They know what to do. They're trained, frankly, from the streets, how to deal with law enforcement, because that's kind of their gig if you're a career criminal. But if you're a law-abiding American, you really only deal with you're only dealing with law enforcement if you're pulled over in a traffic stop, or maybe if you're a victim, you called the cops up because something happened and you're a victim, need their help. Most Americans who are law-abiding, they don't know how to deal with police outside of those two contexts because they never have to do so. And I fear a lot of people will just start talking to the police and say all sorts of things that are incriminating, and they won't even understand why or how. And then by the time they pick up the phone and call their lawyer, it's too late. They've already done the damage. Any thoughts on that as a former criminal defense lawyer, Stephen?
Well, I still am a criminal defense lawyer. And once again, law-abiding people, they only encounter law enforcement normally for legitimate purposes. But if they come knocking on your door, they don't have to warn you that you don't have to talk to them. People are intimidated. You think you have an obligation. Okay, yeah, I'm going to bring my guns out and show you the serial numbers. And then you can check your list. They said, oh, you haven't done anything wrong. We just want to check it out. And they have this pad of paper. And I think it's just beyond the pale. Like, get out of this, get out of law-abiding people's lives and get out there on the street. Look, there's some ATF agents do that. And there's been fights in ATF over the years over which direction they go. You've got those who want to kick butt, have their ATF offices in the bad parts of town because they need to be down there. And then you've got others who, as I said, they want to hang out at gun shows and take license numbers down from the cars that are outside and follow them. And the people like we've been talking about who go knocking on doors. I don't know that they've ever done that much before in terms of what's coming out now, these YouTubes showing this kind of behavior. One agent was so intimidating that I think in Ohio, a woman called the cops on him, and they came and busted him. It was an ATF agent doing the same thing. He was reported as a suspicious character, and they need to get their stuff together. And once again, if there's a legitimate role for ATF, it's going after criminals. It's doing the kind of things that they were set up to do, and not taking the easy way out and just engaging in activity that intimidates law-abiding people.
Stephen, that's been super helpful. One final question. You won a huge Supreme Court 9-0 Supreme Court victory in an appeal associated with the infamous ATF issue associated with the Branch Davidians down in Waco, Texas, which there may be some viewers on this channel that are too young to know that. You can Google that and check out what happened there. But Stephen, just tell us about your big win years ago in that Waco, Texas Branch Davidian case involving the ATF and the Department of Justice, because you won that 9-0 unanimously in favor of Stephen Halbrook and your clients before the Supreme Court. What happened with that case?
Your listeners might remember you had the ATF raid at the Branch Davidian housing project. The word project sounds funny. The different houses or places of abode of this religious sect, and they didn't need to do the raid. If they thought that David Koresh was doing something wrong, they could have picked him up while he was out jogging or down at the auto body shop where he frequented. But instead, they did this raid. They ended up getting 4 ATF agents killed. A number of the residents there were killed. And then we have this siege. And finally, the militaristic type tanks come in. They spew all of this gas into the place. It goes up in flames. And most people died. A few people got out, and so their reward for getting out was, we're going to prosecute you for conspiracy to commit murder and for Gun Control Act violations, using firearms in federal crime of violence. And I was not one of the trial lawyers, but I argued the appeal twice and then argued in the Supreme Court. And basically what happened, the jury found they didn't like what happened there at all. American citizens should not be treated that way. They acquitted all the defendants on the murder charges. They convicted them of a manslaughter charge. They got 10 years imprisonment for that. And they convicted them of carrying guns in federal crime of violence. So that was a 5-year sentence. But then the government persuaded the judge to make up a new rule that they used machine guns, and therefore they get 30 years for the use of the firearms. The jury never heard anything about that. There were machine guns in the raid. The ATF had used MP5 submachine guns. But nonetheless, the judge stuck with that. We ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court on that one issue, whether if they want to say under the Gun Control Act you used a firearm in a federal crime of violence, if you claim it was a machine gun, you've got to put that in the indictment, and the jury has to make that finding. But here the jury just said it was a firearm. So when we got into court and argued the case, we ended up with Justice Breyer writing a favorable opinion saying, upholding the right of jury trial in the Gun Control Act case. And so the sentence was reduced from 40 years back to 15 years for most of the defendants. And they're all out now. They've been out a good while. And I was very happy to be involved in that case. I have no liking for that religious sect per se. But again, Americans should not be treated that way. And the Gun Control Act should be interpreted in a way that the way that Congress passed it, and we should not have new rules made up such that you can stick it to defendants where the jury never convicted you of what it is. If they want to give you the 30-year sentence, they got to prove machine guns, and they did not use machine guns. There was no evidence that any of the Davidians had machine guns, and that they used them in that confrontation. So it was a good strike for the right to jury trial. The decision was, and it was. I was proud to represent the people involved in that case.
Well, Stephen Halbrook, we really appreciate your time yet again. You're always so full of information, knowledge. I know our viewers love to hear from you. And we, again, appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you again soon.
Okay, Mr. Smith, good to see you. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, folks, I hope you learned a little bit something from Stephen Halbrook about gun registries in the United States and how they're illegal under federal law. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner, please do so. And again, we'll see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.